Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. This is the last game week of the regular season here in 2024 for Penn State football. Game number 12 on the schedule, waiting for us on Saturday afternoon in Beaver Stadium. The 4-7 Maryland Terrapins will come to town. Penn State has a 4-game win streak over them. If they can extend it as a 24.5-point favorite on Saturday, Penn State will punch its ticket for a long-awaited college football playoff appearance. We'll get our next look at the college football playoff rankings on Tuesday. We're expecting Penn State to remain essentially where they have been in that top 5 cluster. And ultimately, Penn State would be in a really good spot to get back to Beaver Stadium a few days before Christmas to host a playoff game. But they've got to handle business against Maryland first. We're going to bring in Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen now. And as usual, on a Monday, we are fresh out of a James Franklin press conference. Spent about 45 minutes or so in the Beaver Stadium media room with the Nittany Lions head coach, who, as you'd imagine, carrying some confidence coming into this week because of what took place last Saturday night. Dramatic victory at Minnesota, the kind of game it felt like a lot of teams have lost that kind of a game this year across college football, and it's cost them. Penn State was able to avoid that setback on the road, come away with the win, almost six minutes on that final possession of the matchup. We'll get into some more details from that a little bit later. But Daniel and I broke down the game on Saturday evening. Daniel was out in the stadium in Minneapolis, me here in our Happy Valley headquarters as usual. We'll begin on a Monday with you, Mark. You were in Minneapolis as well. You saw Penn State fall behind 10-0, have an extra point block in return for 2 points to go down 19-16 at halftime, and ultimately prevail by 1 point to put themselves in position for the first 11-win regular season of James Franklin's 11-year tenure here with the Nittany Lions.
Yeah, I mean, they're finding ways to win. You look at the USC game, you look at this game, you touched on it, Tyler. A lot of teams are complaining about where they are in the college football playoff rankings and complaining so much that then they go out and lose. And I've been saying it since the USC game. Take care of business. Take care of business. It is so cliche, but it's almost like James Franklin's 1-0 mantra. You cannot worry about the big picture. If you take care of business and beat the teams you're supposed to beat, you're going to be just fine. And that's what happened with Penn State. With this game, a lot not to like, but the fact that I thought all 3 phases played well when it mattered the most. They really came together. I mean, you get a gigantic special teams play after the special teams struggled. The defense continues to play well in the second half of every game. And then the job that Drew Aller did, he was not as sharp as he was the previous week when he only had 2 incomplete passes. But when they needed him, he got the job done. I thought the drive that he led before the half, even though it ended with the blocked extra point, I thought that was key for Penn State, just to show that they were going to be able to move the ball and do what they needed to do. And then obviously for him to do what he did and for the offense to do what it did on that final drive. They're 1 of 11 on 3rd down in that game. And then they go 3 of 3 on 4th down on that drive. That's winning football, man. That is winning football. I wanted to tell a little unique story too. I apologize there was no Brenningham this week, but we were not allowed on the field. So I waited until the game was pretty much over to go down on the field. And as fate would have it, I ended up landing at the concourse underneath the level underneath the stadium, right as Andy Kotelnicki was walking toward the Penn State locker room in the field. And I kidded them because before the game, I sent you guys a video of this. They were hassling him because they wouldn't let him on the field because he didn't have his credential. So he went and got the credential and was like waving it, like, oh, here it is, and he had a couple of funny choice words. And I said, do you think you're going to need your credential to get on the field now? And he just kind of laughed. But what he said as we were walking along, and this is one of the cool things about Kotelnicki, it's like nothing just happened. He's like, hey, that's a really good Minnesota defense. And I spent so much time talking about how bad Minnesota's offense was before that game that I don't think I acknowledged how well that defense has played for most of the season. And that defense did a really good job. And Minnesota overall, you saw that they made the most of their bye week. I mean, they came out, they were fresh, they were healthy, they got after it. That's a tough, hard-hitting Generally well-coached team, maybe not toward the end of the game with some of the decisions, but I thought that was a team that defensively especially played really well. And for the offense to do the things it did when it did it, I thought was really important. So I know that's a lot, and that you guys covered probably most of that in the post game, but those were a couple of the things that stood out to me.
James Franklin said it in his press conference on Monday. He's reiterated it a bunch this fall. It feels like finding a way to win, as you said, Mark, and how many teams across college football are scratching their heads, wondering if they could add a play or two, go the opposite direction. And as you laid out there, very good. When you're 1 of 11 on third downs, when you get to halftime and your running backs have 15 total rushing yards, when you've got a block punt, when you've got a blocked extra points that results in points for the other team, you've got something up your sleeve with Tyler Warren punting the ball that didn't work out the way you would have hoped. It leaves a lot to be desired, and yet they're in the win column. And Daniel, let's get to the players who stood out from this matchup. And Penn State has their staff picks that they announce every Sunday. We'll talk about Drew Aller more because I think he deserves more commentary, and we got some from James Franklin on Monday. But for the fourth time in 11 matchups, Tyler Warren was the staff's pick for offensive player of the game. 8 catches, over 100 receiving yards. Mentioned this on our post-game podcast, but he's a guy who went from he's a guy who now has 5 100-yard receiving games in his career at Penn State. No one else has done that in a Nittany Lions uniform at the tight end position, and he's done all of that since the Peach Bowl last December. So I know we're running out of things to say about Warren here, but Daniel, give it your best shot.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you look at the key players in that game, he really does stand out. Franklin, again, today, earlier Monday, went back to reiterate the quote surrender call that they had and how Tyler Warren has the opportunity to take that into the end zone. And if he does that, he breaks Pat Fryermuth's record for most receiving touchdowns by a tight end. But he elects to go down, keep the clock moving, and preserve that win for Penn State. I think that the commentary on Tyler Warren has been pretty consistent this year. He just does a lot of different things, and I think that it's a testament to him where a couple things didn't go right for him on Saturday, which really feels like the first time that's been the case. He got stuffed on those 2 direct snaps. He has that bad punt, but he's still there at the end of the game to haul that in and ice the game. So I think really good game for Warren. 8 catches, 102 yards. That's his 4th 100-yard game of the year. And like you laid out, Tyler, this has been a hell of a calendar year for Tyler Warren going back to last December.
Yeah, it really has. And it's also been a really strong season for Zane Durant. I mean, he's a guy that when you look about this team and you say, who's been the breakout standouts now? We've got almost a full regular season under our belts. Obviously, Tyler Warren on the national level takes the cake, but I think locally, Mark, it's hard to ignore what Zane Durant has accomplished as a junior. We had our head wrapped around him pretty well coming into the season. He was a starter last year as a sophomore. Year before that, he was a burn your red shirt freshman coming out of preseason camp, and we saw quite a bit from him in 2022. But now he is such a disruptive presence where opposing coordinators are having fits with him over the course of a week. And then we see it come game action, getting into the backfield, 2.5 tackles for loss on the road at Minnesota. I believe he's at 8.5 tackles for loss on the season now. That's far and away a career high for him. I don't know what the NFL decision makers will think of him, and he's only a junior right now, but he has been so important for Penn State in the interior. And he was one of 2 defensive picks by this staff for player of the game, along with middle linebacker Kobe King, who has been Mr. Consistent, I feel like, at the heart of this defense.
Yeah, one thing on what Daniel was talking about, they need to change that from surrender to either Devin Ford play or the Penix play. I mean, one of the two, because that's where Penn State really learned what happens when you don't surrender. But yeah, in terms of Zane Durant, I mentioned it after the game in my takes. He only ends up with 5 tackles. That's a lot of tackles for a defensive tackle. But you see Jay Reed with 10 and Kobe King with 9, and but the tackles for loss and the way he's disrupting things, even when he's not making plays. And then I'll take it a step further. When he comes off the field, you notice a noticeable decline, and that's not a knock on the players behind him. that's the fact that he's just playing that well. I mean, he's playing at a little bit different level, and it's almost too bad that it's impossible for players at that position anymore to play every snap the way that offensive linemen do. It just is very difficult to do, and it goes kind of against what Penn State and almost everybody else does in trying to keep those guys fresh. So, yeah, unbelievable job. I think he's done nothing but increase his draft stock. I think he's one of those guys who the draft analysts haven't seen him yet, but you know that the NFL scouts have. And, you know, with the way he's playing, it's even elevated now because, and I know we're going to get to it a little bit more, but, you know, Beeman left and now Alonzo Ford is going to be out, and he's going to have to keep playing at that level. And if he can, hopefully get him even more snaps in these bigger games that are coming down the road. Ideally, he won't have to play the entire game against Maryland, and he can be super, super, super fresh. But I would not be surprised, you know, if, as expected, they host a playoff game, that you're going to see his snap levels increase even further. I think he had, what was it, Tyler, 46 of 60 some this past week. I could see him, you know, elevating that just because of the level he's playing and because depth has been hurt there.
They were able to get Zane Durant and some of the other frontline defenders some additional rest during wins over Washington and Purdue. Those were blowout scenarios, and so that maybe pays off down the stretch here a little bit. You know that in between Maryland and maybe a playoff matchup down the road, unless you were to get in the Big Ten title game, you've got maybe 3 weeks there to get your legs back underneath you. And Kobe King, just to hit on his selection as well, 9 tackles. 1.5 of those for loss. He's a guy that has gotten into the backfield with some regularity. He had a sack against Ohio State, had a sack against Washington. And I think his role, guys, has been more crystallized over the course of the season because what you haven't gotten out of Tony Rojas as a sophomore, and because you've had Dom DeLuca, you know, in and out of the lineup with injuries for a while, we don't really have any backup linebacker presence to talk about on a weekly basis. So to me, you know, even more important than we thought he might be is Kobe King playing middle linebacker, being a defensive team captain with KJ Winston sidelined since early September, the other captain on that side of the ball. So giving him a quick tip of the cap as well. It's his first selection as defensive player of the week. Zane Durant's gotten it 3 times. And then Daniel, I'm going to tee you up for some more Dominic Ruley perspective, because I know you caught up with him after the game. Actually, he wasn't available after the game in Minnesota. I think that might change this week, but you caught up with his teammates after the game in Minnesota. This is a backup center, a guy who joined the program as a walk-on a few years ago. You probably hadn't noticed him doing some special team stuff or getting in late in relief of Nick Dawkins and some of these blowouts, but I think everybody has noticed them since Saturday night, and part of that is James Franklin keeps banging the table and calling him the quarterback of that play, the guy who had to make the call on the fake punt. He was a selection for Special Teams Player of the Week, as was Ryan Barker, who converted both of his field goal opportunities in Minneapolis.
Yeah, to start with Barker, he's joined the list of people that we're not talking enough about, which is getting longer and longer by the week. But you know, there's something to be said for Barker and the steadiness that he has brought to that position after a month of uneven play again from Sanders to Haydak. I think that Barker has really shown what he's capable of doing and how he approaches things, and we've seen the results. James Franklin again today made it very clear that the blocked extra point was not on Barker. And I think also Barker's inclusion as a special teams player of the game probably speaks to that as well. But to go back to Ruley, Franklin's done a really nice job of laying out the mechanics of that play and how things work, which we don't always get sometimes. And so I think, you know, for Franklin to highlight how, you know, they put this in, they've been repping it since, you know, training camp. They've put it in for a couple games, and it's all dependent on the look that they get from the opposing return team, and everything that goes into that. I think has been really interesting, and I think has really shed some light on Dominic Ruley's role there. I think that I've gone back and watched that play a bunch of times since Saturday night, and it's one of those things where everything just works to perfection when you look at how it all came together. You have, you know, Ruley not only making the call, but being the lead blocker through the hole, walling off, you know, one guy who was in pursuit. You got Cooper Cousins blocking to the outside, you know, sealing off the rusher off the edge. And, you know, that hole, I think one of us probably could have run through it. It was so big. And then James Franklin also brought up Dakari Nelson, who was lined up on the edge of the line, just driving his man 15 yards downfield and finishing that block. You think about special teams, and not only is it something that it's not in the spotlight a lot, it's a lot of players who aren't in the spotlight a lot of times. And you joke about it, where for a lot of these guys, it's probably for the best that you don't know their names, because if you don't know their names, that means everything is working well. I think Chris Stoll would talk about it, where he said that he liked it because if people knew who he was and if people were talking about him, it was probably because he messed up when he was the long snapper here. And so I think it's cool to see those guys get that credit. And it's also been fun to look back at that play and just see how everything lined up, perfectly, and really did make the perfect call there.
Yeah, and we heard from James Franklin that he thought Dakari Nelson may have thrown the block of the game in that situation. Nelson, of course, a converted safety playing linebacker. He's been a special teams contributor throughout the year. And then Tyler Elsdon, a fifth-year senior linebacker that we haven't seen much on defense in Big Ten action. He also threw a key block on that play. When you pull off a play like that, everybody looks good for the part that they played along the way. And let's focus on that final possession, Mark, because Daniel and I discussed it pretty extensively in the post-game podcast, but you have covered a bunch of pressure cooker situations for James Franklin now through 11 seasons. Typically, Michigan and Ohio State are going to get the most attention, and some of the tentativeness that we've seen, or some of the decision-making that we've seen, has been questioned about James Franklin in the aftermath of those losses. He joked that if that doesn't go right on the fake punt, that instead of roast turkeys being the topic of discussion today, we'd all be roasting James Franklin. I appreciated that line from the head coach. But what did you make of that tone-setting call on the final drive, followed by two more fourth and short goes by James Franklin and company?
Well, you didn't see any panic. I mean, that was the one thing about Ohio State, when they went away from what was working for them when the game was on the line. I mean, and that's where, I'm going to go back to Aller. As much credit as James Franklin is getting for pushing the right buttons, Aller had an 8-yard scramble that set up a fourth down and 1, I think it was. That was that the fake punt, I believe. And then he had a 7-yard scramble, and then he had a 1-yard tush push kind of quarterback sneak for a first down on a fourth down. So when your quarterback is making these plays, I mean, that is good coaching, because you coached him up to make these plays.
And the touchdown run, and the play, the last throw to Warren, where he's looking toward the running back to dump it off to. He's got to move to his left all of a sudden. Right. He gets to Warren. Yeah. And
that's so my point being, though, is that as much as you want to credit, you remember when they lost out there, Sean Clifford threw 3 interceptions. And that's the other thing that nobody's talking about. This was a team, people aren't talking enough about it, excuse me. But this is a team that came in leading the Big Ten in turnover margin. And for Aller to come out of that game, I think there was one play where it could have been maybe picked, where a pass was kind of batted or something. But generally speaking, he did not put the ball in danger. And sometimes that's what you need to do to win. And then on that final drive, guys, make the play when it's there. And he did. And so, again, credit to coaching staff for developing him into this quarterback. Kotelnicki, Danny O'Brien, we need to talk about him more. I'm starting to talk like Franklin. It's scaring me. But, yeah, having a quarterback who's making those plays, that's the most important part. And, clearly he has this great feel with Tyler Warren. I mean, if you look at Warren's production in the first half of that game, and then when the game's on the line in the second half, all of a sudden, Aller's looking for him on like every single pass. I don't think a receiver had a target, beyond in the fourth quarter, or, until there weren't many receiver targets late in that game. Let's put it that way. So yeah, I think Aller's the guy who was pushing all the right buttons and doing the right things, and deserves a ton of credit, even though the numbers weren't spectacular.
I mentioned this stat on the post-game podcast now, but over 70% pass completion in 8 of the last 9 games, after doing that in only 4 contests out of 13 as a sophomore starter. And Daniel, we did get a little bit more perspective on Drew Aller, that performance. I think got a lot of attention because during the national television broadcast, they showed James Franklin approaching Aller after the Tyler Warren punt, and it didn't work out so well. And you're wondering, well, what's Drew upset about? Is it the play call? Is it his performance? Is it the fact that they're losing on the road in Minnesota? And he was showing some fieriness. And then you saw James Franklin approach him on the bench, have a chat. Drew Aller talked about that a bit coming out of the game, but we heard it from James Franklin in this situation. What did you learn about what went down on the sideline there based on what Franklin had to tell us?
Watching that clip back too, something else that was pretty neat is you see Denai Dennis Sutton grab Aller, and then at the end of the clip, you see Anthony Donka, who is on crutches and in street clothes, get Aller's attention, but before he goes back out onto the field. So I think that's a look at some of the sideline dynamics. Franklin said that he thought that maybe some of the reaction to it was misinterpreted about what Aller was actually upset at. He said that Aller was upset that they couldn't get the snap off, that he was calling for Dawkins to snap the ball to Warren, and Dawkins, couldn't hear him. After the game, Aller said, I went back and listened last night, and Aller said that Minnesota had the cadence, and so Dawkins was down to snap, and he didn't know if it was Aller or if it was Minnesota who was calling for the ball. And Franklin said that Aller is just so attuned to the time management and the play clock, which is something that we've seen throughout the season. Like when you watch Aller, if the play clock is getting down and things aren't going how they need to, I think that's when you really see him get agitated and you really see that emotion come out. And so that's where that came from. It was that Aller's frustration, with not being able to get the snap off, with not, having to go down in the play clock, and just, I guess, not having a smooth operation. And I think that that's one thing that stood out too with Aller, is that he knows so much and he seems so in tune with this offense that he knows exactly what needs to be happening when. And I think that when it doesn't, he doesn't like it, and who can blame him? But Franklin was complimentary of Aller. He said that he wants them to be fiery, that he wants to see that side of him. He added the caveat that, like with everything, you don't want to see it go to extremes, but to see this side of him is something that Franklin has really liked. And I think that it's been a pretty neat storyline going all the way back to West Virginia, like 3 months ago now, that Aller has sustained that sort of edge, and that that wasn't like a blip. That wasn't just this is the adrenaline of week one. We're in however 13 weeks into the season now. They've played a lot of football. They were on the road in Minnesota in a tough game, and Aller is still having that kind of edge, still having that kind of intensity. I think that shows a lot about the type of quarterback he's been this year. So I thought that was also some good insight from James Franklin on what was going on there, and how he feels that that's been a big benefit to the team.
I think that's who he is at this point. I mean, we heard about it in August. We heard about it in spring camp. Well, Drew's coming a long way. His attitude, his ability to control the huddle and all this stuff. Okay, let me see it in the game. We saw it right away, week one on the road at West Virginia, and you noticed it then. And now, as you said, it's crunch time. College football playoffs are a possibility, very much so. And he's delivering that kind of demeanor on the field when they need it. And by the way, no turnovers in the last 3 road games for Drew Aller. You got to go back to that 3 interception performance at USC on October 12th, the last time he turned the ball over on the road. And Mark, elsewhere in that backfield, we are seeing clear signs of progress from Nick Singleton, which is a great thing for Penn State. There's some injuries we're going to get to in a second. There are some key players that are not going to be available for them moving forward. But Nick Singleton, who was out for that UCLA game about 7 weeks ago now, but felt like he was never fully back for a significant stretch, really about a month after that matchup. That's begun to change a little bit. You saw it against Washington early in that matchup, including a kickoff return for a touchdown that was called off by a penalty. But then you saw it pick up again at Purdue. 6 yards per carry on the ground, 20 yards on 2 catches. And then last week, he did his thing as a receiver, 6 catches. That's a career high. He's been really important through the air. But 13 carries, 63 yards. That's 5 yards per carry, essentially. He had a 10-yard or 12-yard touchdown run. And I asked James Franklin after the press conference today, Is he picking that up from Nick Singleton, that things are moving in the right direction? And Mark, he took that and kind of ran with it and said Singleton wasn't operating at 100%. Like a lot of guys, you're trying to play through stuff. But he said now it's clear that he is operating at more of a full speed. And if that's what you're going to get from number 10, I think there's questions about Katron Allen a little bit right now. And because he hasn't been getting the yards per carry, he wasn't involved in the first half last week. But if Nick Singleton can be more like the guy we saw in the first month of the season versus the last 6-7 weeks, that gives you more of an edge offensively. And we weren't sure that that would reappear for this team.
Yeah, I would argue that the silver lining behind him being banged up is he had to find a way to keep contributing. And to his credit, he did. He did that as a receiver. I don't have the stats here in front of me. I don't know if you have them up, but if you look at what he was doing as a receiver during that stretch, scoring touchdowns, making unbelievable catches, finding a way to contribute when he was not at 100%, I think that's made him a better all-around player. You know, you mentioned it, Tyler. You go back to last week's game, and he had 6 catches too. You know, not just a 13 carries. So I think he's developed himself into a more rounded player by being selfless. But when he's banged up, he played through an injury and had to find a way to contribute. And the way he contributed was by catching passes. So now Aller, you know, the one thing I would say about Aller is he clearly has guys that he's in a comfort zone with, right? And those guys are Tyler Warren and Singleton, that he will throw them the ball, you know, if they're double covered, whatever, and put it there for them to make a catch. I remember the one game where Singleton had the falling down catch, you know, in the end zone, and how many times has he put up 50-50 balls for Tyler Warren? And so he has developed that trust with Aller, and I think that just made him a better player, and it's going to make them that much more difficult to defend moving forward, because you don't know if Nick Singleton can beat you on the ground or beat you through the air. And again, I can't say enough about him playing through the injury. I mean, when we talked about this with Franklin earlier in the year, he talked about the it's kind of a maturation process that a lot of these guys have never been banged up. And there's a difference between being seriously hurt with a long-term thing and being bumped and bruised, something that you can play through. And to see guys learn how to do that, again, I think Singleton's going to be a better player because of it.
Singleton has 30 catches on the season. That's the third best total for Penn State, 275 yards, 4 touchdown catches too. You go back to his freshman year when he was the Big Ten freshman of the year, 11 catches, 85 yards, 1 score as a receiver. So he has come a long way in that department. It's been very important for Penn State. Looking ahead here, guys, we've got a few injury issues to get to. Anthony Donko and Alonzo Ford in the trenches. Donko starting right tackle for all but one game this year, and he still played in that game against Ohio State when Rucci got the start. He was banged up a little bit at different portions of the season, but this one's a big blow. Ruled out long-term after exiting very early against Minnesota. And then Alonzo Ford, defensive tackle, who's 4th at that position in game snaps on the season. He is out long-term as well, according to James Franklin. We saw him exit on the road to Minneapolis on Saturday night. So not positive news for those two players. Means more Nolan Rucci at right tackle. It could mean more J.B. Nelson as relevance of a player of relevance on your offensive line. James Franklin said he could be a swing tackle. We've seen a lot of him at guard on the season as well. And then with Alonzo Ford, Daniel, this one kind of further complicates the defensive tackle spot because it was a 5-man approach coming into November. Hakeem Beamon exited that equation a few weeks ago. He was no longer with the program going into the Washington game. And now Alonzo Ford, who's been one of the true pleasant surprises for Penn State, coming off that injury that cost him the entire 2023 season. Now he's back on the shelf. So you've got the 2 starters in Jay Thomas and Durant, who we just talked about a lot. You've got Keziah Izzard, a well-experienced veteran, as your number 3. Beyond that, though, it's getting dicey.
Yeah, it puts Penn State into a tough spot in the trenches, especially when you talk about getting to this point in the season. I think the one thing that maybe you can take solace in if you're Penn State is that you had that 5-man rotation into November, and that you even got through with a 4-man rotation into late November. So theoretically, maybe Zane Durant, Devon J. Thomas, Keziah Izzard are more fresh than maybe they would be if you had gone with a 3-man rotation the whole year. But at the same time, you're going to need people to step up. I wrote about it in the story about Dominic Rulli on Saturday night, where in a game that Penn State had to have, you had your your 5-star quarterback, maybe the number one most important player on the team, come through in a couple of big spots. Then you had your walk-on offensive lineman, who is the personal protector in punt formation, come through and make the right decision in a play. It was the same thing at USC when you had your walk-on kicker come through with a big kick. So you look at the other defensive tackles on the roster. Ken Xavier Gilliam, who we've heard a lot of good things about and who has made the travel roster. Seemed like he was working his way up into the depth chart. He'll be playing team from his home state this weekend. Can he put himself in a position to where he can get onto the field and contribute? Do you get anything out of Ty Blanding or Caleb Artis? I think that's where you have to look next for Penn State. And at the same time, I think that Tom Allen has been doing this for a long time, and we've seen them do some creative things this year with different personnel groupings, different alignments, to see if anything cooked up to potentially make up for that loss, to maybe take advantage of some defensive end depth, things like that, to make up for having a little bit of lack of depth on the interior. We know Smith Vilbert has dropped a lot of weight since he was originally slated to move in there, but he at least has experience, playing on the interior a little bit from practice. So we'll see. I think I'm interested in how that shakes out. Maryland does have a couple pretty decent running backs, so you're not expecting them to do too much, but I think that's something to watch there for the interior. But this is where you need some guys to step up. It's that time of the year. You still have what you want ahead of you, and you're going to need everyone from number 1 to number 120 on that roster to be ready when their number's called.
Last week when Penn State was blowing out Purdue, obviously they were able to get some of those defensive linemen to the sideline. Who was the next defensive tackle up from the depth chart? It was Xavier Gilliam. Played almost 20 snaps, led the way, more than Artis, more than Blanding, guys who have been on campus longer than him. So he's played 2 games now as a freshman, but we have heard it consistently going back to really last winter about him showing up here ready to work. It's been a position with 5 veterans going into November that you just felt like you had figured out. Football changes things. That's the nature of this sport. And now we're approaching Thanksgiving with 3 identified veterans and then kind of wondering what comes next. Something else we'll be keeping tabs on from an injury standpoint when we get our look at practice on Wednesday this week. Julian Fleming, Elliott Washington, guys who were listed on that availability report last week as out in Washington's case and questionable in Fleming's case. Fleming ultimately got in for very, very brief work on offense, but those are a couple guys we'll keep tabs on. And then just to add to the Nick Singleton commentary, James Franklin says Denai Dennis Sutton falls into a very similar category of somebody who has been playing through an injury issue, maybe wasn't operating at the level we're accustomed to seeing, but we're seeing that positive momentum now in mid to late November and feeling like he's on the right track. So in Singleton and Denai Dennis Sutton's case, maybe the best is yet to come for them, or you're going to get to see them be a little bit more effective than where they were for much of this season of late due to injuries. But that's it for us from James Franklin's press conference. There's a lot more coverage coming your way over at Lions247.com. I'm going to shift gears and jump into some recruiting talk right now with Tyler Calvaruso, but Daniel and Mark will be back with me on Wednesday. We'll get our previews up a day earlier with Thanksgiving arriving this week. So talk to you both real soon.
Thanks, Tyler.
Will do.
All right, as promised, we've got some recruiting to get to, and Tyler Calvaruso was on the road this past weekend, hearing from a couple key Penn State flip targets as we get nearer to National Signing Day. That early period begins December 4th this year, a couple weeks ahead of where it's been on the calendar in recent cycles. Tyler, welcome back in. Appreciate you for joining us. We just spent a lot of time talking about Penn State's 10th win of the season. We will spend a little bit of time with you breaking down who's showing up to Beaver Stadium for game number 12 on the schedule from a recruiting standpoint. But let's begin with a couple guys you got up close and personal with in recent days on the flip front. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me. First of all, very nice Christmas tree in the background there.
Thank you.
Big fan. But yeah, man, it was a busy weekend. Friday night, made the 2.5-hour trip out to Altoona to check out Central Catholic and State College High in the PIAA 6A quarters, and Central Catholic rolled. Got the chance to see Bradley Gompers in action, top 24/7 Duke linebacker commit. Penn State's pushing to make a move down the stretch with him. And then on Saturday, headed out to Shamokin Area High, checked in with Andrew Olish, the elite Michigan tight end commit. Penn State also trying to make a move there. So it was a busy weekend for me on the flip front. Got some good stuff out of it.
Let's start with Gompers. He's a guy that's been committed to Duke and Manny Diaz for quite some time. He's also at Central Catholic, a program that Penn State recruits on a regular basis. James Franklin said they want all the good players from Central Catholic. He referenced that earlier this season. They've got one on board, Xavier Thomas, and you can probably give us some fresh feedback on him in a moment because I know he played well in that matchup. But when it comes to Gompers, what did you see from him on the field? And perhaps more importantly for our listeners, what are you sensing as he's getting closer to a decision to either stick with Duke and head down to Durham or stay in his home state and become a Nittany Lion? I don't know if there's any other balls hanging in the air that he's juggling, but I know those are the two that we've been discussing quite a bit here in recent months.
And I'll tell you one thing. I could see why he's went from a recruit ranked outside the top 24/7 and knocking on the door of that top 100. I mean, he was flying around the field, making plays sideline to sideline on defense, had a key sack, a bunch of tackles on backside pursuit. Just his athleticism flashes. It's impossible to miss. On offense, he was delivering from his tight end position as usual. You know, Central Catholic uses him in a lot of different ways. They flex him out to function as basically a receiving tight end. They play him in line when they have to. And he had an early 40-yard touchdown reception for Central Catholic, put them up early. It was a highly productive night for him. Best player on the field, in my opinion. Xavier Thomas had a really good game too, and we'll get into that. But Gompers he was flying around making plays, heat-seeking missile type player for Central Catholic. And, you know, coming down to it, it's getting a little bit complicated now because Central Catholic is going to play Harrisburg on Saturday in the 6A semifinals. And that essentially, with a 1 p.m. kickoff in Altoona, that essentially eliminates the opportunity for Gompers to get out and see Penn State on Saturday when the Nittany Lions host Maryland. You know, Penn State's exploring avenues to get Gompers on campus in another capacity. Same deal with Michigan. You know, Duke is on the road this week. So, you know, there's a lot going on in that recruitment right now. Right now, he is still on board with Duke, has been locked in with Manny Diaz and the Blue Devils since the summer. You know, Duke made a move on him when a lot of other programs were still kind of feeling things out, waiting for that senior season film to roll out early in the year. And you've seen all the offers for Gompers roll in since then. You know, when I got the chance to catch up with Gompers real quick after the game, he politely declined to discuss his recruitment at this point as we inch closer to the beginning of the early signing period. So Central Catholic playing on a Saturday from the Penn State perspective definitely threw a little bit of a wrench in things, but Penn State's going to continue to work that one all the way up until Gompers put pens to paper.
Well, we appreciate you driving 2.5 hours, even if you didn't get the juicy quote about Penn State and his recruitment there. I know you got a lot more intel related to Gompers from that trip for yourself, and we'll keep tabs on him moving forward. Before we talk about the other flip target that you actually did speak with and have a story up on Lions247.com about an elite tight end recruit, Andrew Olish, let's get to the Penn State commit you also saw in action Friday night, trying to go win that state championship. And while it remains to be seen if Gompers joins the party in Penn State's 2025 recruiting class, Xavier Thomas has been part of that party for a very long time. Cornerback commit, had a couple of interceptions in that matchup. What did you see from him? And ultimately, how do you think he makes that transition to Penn State?
It was a quiet first half for him, mainly because State College didn't bother trying to throw the ball his way on his side of the field. It was a pretty quiet first half performance for Thomas, and that goes for offensively too. I believe he only had one touch on offense. And Central Catholic gets him involved a lot, but they were rolling on the ground. I mentioned the Gompers touchdown. So second half was when Thomas really started to get going. State College had to take to the air a little bit more, facing a deficit. They started to challenge Thomas a little bit. Didn't really go well. He had a third quarter interception to set up a Central Catholic touchdown. Then State College's final play of the game on offense, Thomas came down with an interception, his 6th of the year. I saw fluidity in coverage. You know, this is my first time seeing Thomas in game action. Got the chance to see him camp earlier in his prep career, but first time seeing him in game action. Definitely a fluid mover at corner on the outside, fundamentally sound. You see the athleticism and the speed that have Penn State so high on him. I got the chance to catch up with Thomas a little bit after the game, and he could see himself work on the outside at the next level. I do think the nickel inside is probably better projection for him in terms of his size, but it wouldn't surprise me if he could make plays on the outside playing in a Power 4 conference. He's not afraid to mix up and be physical when he has to. Me and you and everyone else, really, we've tossed around the Daquan Hardy comps a bunch, and I see it. I definitely do see it. He might even have a little bit higher of a ceiling than Hardy did at this point in his prep career. Admittedly, I would have to go back and rewatch Hardy's prep tape, but I liked what I saw out of Thomas. I think Penn State, when they moved early, there was a lot of internal confidence behind that take, and Thomas has just continued to roll throughout his senior year. He's really shown everyone why Penn State was so high on his skill set, and Thomas loves Terry Smith. He thinks Terry Smith is the cornerbacks coach who's going to take his game to the next level. So Penn State has been really thrilled with Thomas's progress throughout the fall, and seeing it in person on Friday night, I can understand why.
You'll follow a couple of cornerbacks who are in the current Penn State freshman class, and Kenny Wosley and John Mitchell coming soon to Happy Valley. Let's go over to the Saturday matchup you went to, and that involved Andrew Olesh and his high school squad. He has been committed to Michigan for quite some time now, a few months. He has gotten a chance to go explore the college football recruiting landscape a bit. That includes trips to Alabama and Penn State, and he's been out to Oregon, and so he seemed pretty candid with you, at least all things considered, this close to signing day. I wouldn't have been surprised if he said, hey, I don't want to talk about it right now, but he opened up a bit with you. What can you share with our listeners, with our audience, what you can glean from that conversation regarding Olesh and what he wants to determine to do next?
He was pretty open. I spent about 5-10 minutes talking to him post game, and he was very candid about where things are at in his recruitment right now. Once we wrapped up, he jogged off, hopped on the bus with his Southern Lehigh teammates. He and his family got ready to hop on a flight to Ann Arbor. So he spent Sunday at Michigan. Main part of that trip for him was catching up with Bryce Underwood, the newly minted 5-star quarterback flip. Michigan gets him on board after he spent a long time in that LSU class, top-ranked prospect in the nation. That's a big deal for the Wolverines, and it's something that Olesh was monitoring quite closely. So he wanted to get to Ann Arbor on Sunday. He was originally going to go on Saturday, but the weather in PA had other ideas. His playoff game gets bumped from Friday to Saturday. So he's playing Saturday afternoon, hops on the flight, spends his Sunday at Michigan, catches up with Underwood and the rest of the staff. As far as I know, moving forward with Olesh, that Oregon official visit that he has had on his schedule for November 30th, still on the docket. Oregon tight ends coach Drew Merringer was actually going to get out to see Olesh play on Friday night, checked in on him at his school earlier on Friday. Weather shifted things around again. Merringer had to head home, but him making the trip out there was something Olesh really appreciated. He's looking forward to getting back to Eugene for his official. He's got a good relationship with Merringer, good relationship with head coach Dan Lanning. And then, of course, from the Penn State perspective, Olesh was back on campus for the Ohio State game earlier this month, and that gave him a good look at the creativity of the Penn State offense under Andy Kotelnicki's watch and the tight end utilization, which is something Olesh has been keeping a really close eye on throughout the year. Penn State caught up with Olesh earlier last week for a conversation. James Franklin's Ty Howell, they've continued to work that one really, really hard. Olesh went as far as saying Ty Howell is one of the top tight ends coaches in the nation. He called Tyler Warren probably the best tight end in college football right now, has him billed as a first-round pick. So he's definitely got some intrigue into what Penn State has been doing with its tight ends throughout this year. And make no mistake about it, James Franklin's public pitch, even though it didn't mention Olesh by name, he's been hearing plenty of that behind closed doors as well as Penn State tries to make this one happen. But I know moving forward, there is a level of confidence from the Michigan side in keeping Olesh on board, especially now that Underwood is committed. And, he's got some good relationships at Oregon, and he's going to get a second look at the Ducks. So that's what Penn State is up against here down the stretch. Nittany Lions is another deal. Just like Gompers, they're not going to stop until Olesh signs.
Unfortunately, you spoke with him a few hours before freshman tight end Luke Reynolds delivered one of the plays of the year for Penn State on a 32-yard run on a fake punt. But they've been getting the freshman involved as well. He had a touchdown against Purdue, part of the package that they're trying to present Olesh and his family. And now that we're down to the wire, but like you said, maybe heading out to Eugene to see Oregon in just a matter of days. And then there's not much time left for him to come to a final decision here. It seems like he'll end up in the Big Ten, but where? That's certainly the next question. Now, flips work both ways. Let's be honest there, and we're getting late. There's a lot of teams looking around for pieces they might want to add, and so I'm going to present a couple defensive names from Penn State's current class. They are committed to the Nittany Lions. We're anticipating they're going to sign with the Nittany Lions on December 4th, and yet we've got some updates there. Jaden Woods, who is the top-ranked overall recruit in this class, edge rusher out of Kansas, was on an SEC campus last weekend. And then we also saw Chaz Coleman, the latest addition to this class, a rising athlete from the state of Ohio. Well, the Buckeyes finally decided to offer last week once he was committed to Penn State. So, Tyler, what's kind of the level of nervous energy that Penn State fans need to be investing when it comes to both Coleman and Woods?
Penn State's trying to lock both of these guys down in the stretch, and now they've got fights on their hands in both regards. For what it's worth, the Woods official visit to Florida, Penn State staff was made privy to that beforehand, so it wasn't an instance of him just, popping up on campus and Penn State finds out later. But we always say, and it's not just when Penn State's trying to flip a kid, it's when other programs are trying to flip a kid as well. You're popping up on a campus this late in the game, especially now. I mean, we're less than 2 weeks, and we're almost exactly 1 week away from the beginning of the signing period. It's notable. And for Woods to get a multi-day look at the Gators, who had a really big win over Ole Miss this weekend, it's notable. Right now, we're working to see what level of concern Penn State, could or should have with Woods down the stretch. Again, Florida, they kept this visit quiet. Our guy Blake Alderman over at 1224/7 has done a great job tracking this one down and, keeping us privy to what's going on from the Gainesville side of things. But right now, we're working to see where things stand with Woods moving forward. Penn State's going to continue to try to get that one closed down and get him signed with that signing period inching closer by the minute. And then with Chaz Coleman, as far as we know, he did not pop up at Ohio State for it to win over Indiana, which is good news. But Penn State's not exactly out of the woods on the visit front just yet because the Buckeyes have Michigan coming to town on Saturday. Does Coleman pop up for that? We'll see. It's something that we are monitoring. And look, we got to call a spade a spade. Chaz Coleman's an Ohio kid. He's got his Ohio State offer. And traditionally, these scenarios down the stretch, the Buckeyes tend to fare pretty well. And one thing that in asking around, I gathered, this is outside of the Penn State realm, is Ohio State, the way they operate on the trail a lot of the time, whether it's an in-state kid or an out-of-state kid, if they're making an offer this late down the stretch, they feel they have a chance to make a move. So you've got to take that for what you will at this point. There's definitely a level of concern with Coleman right now. Communication between Penn State and Coleman has been good since that offer came in. Just like Woods, Penn State's working to finalize this one, get Coleman on board because they were really bullish on his upside. But Ohio State poses a real threat. There's no way around that.
A pair of projected edge rushers, guys that there's a lot of excitement about long-term. Can Penn State weather the storm, get to signing day, have them both on board, and move forward with them as future Nittany Lions? We'll find out soon enough. There's going to be a bunch of coverage over at Lions247.com in the coming days. Because of the Thanksgiving holiday this week, this will be the only time we expect to have Tyler Calvaruso on the podcast, but we will be focused in on signing day next week. We're going to have a ton of coverage at the site and here on the podcast, so get ready to learn a lot about this 2025 recruiting class. Before we say goodbye, Tyler, I do want to get into this final trip to Beaver Stadium of the regular season, because as we've been talking about, you may be getting a chance to get back in Beaver Stadium, get recruits back in Beaver Stadium just a few days before Christmas for a playoff game. But first things first, Maryland's coming to town. Not really a sexy matchup because it's a 4-7 Terps team. It's a 24.5-point spread when you look at what Las Vegas outlook for this matchup. But ultimately, it's a 3:30 kickoff that opens a little bit more possibilities than a noon kickoff would for visitors to get to campus. Who are some of the names that we need to know already? It's only Monday. You're going to be tracking this all week. You'll have it over at Lions247.com. But last chance to do this in the regular season. Home game number 7. They've taken their swings at some big-time talent. Who's on that list this time around?
Big name right now is Joey O'Brien. Confirmation on that coming via Brian Doan. I mean, we say it over and over again, does the best job for us throughout the Northeast. He caught up with O'Brien following his Ohio State visit and offer from the Buckeyes, and he's going to be back at Penn State for the third time this fall, which is noteworthy because, I mean, that's an understatement to be completely honest with you. Joey O'Brien is one of those top names in the 26 class for Penn State. He is among the most wanted overall prospects in that class, not just because he is an elite Pennsylvania guy, an in-state kid Penn State wants to keep home. He can ball on either side of the field. Penn State has been working that one really hard, going to get him back on campus for the regular season finale. It's a big deal. Beyond that, it's definitely still coming together in the early stages. Some of the names standing out to me right now: Peter Bork, top 100 quarterback in that 27 class. Penn State does not have a ton of offers out at the position right now. Bork's one of them. He's going to profile as a top target for Danny O'Brien and company moving forward. There's Brady Edmonds from California, who is at the top of that pecking order right now. Bork's right there with him. Penn State staff really likes him. After offering during the summer, seeing him throw during the first of 2 whiteout camps during a day where the staff even told him, hey, look, you don't have to throw. Bork decided still get out there, get as many reps as he could under the watch of Danny O'Brien. I think the Nittany Lions are faring quite well there early on. Beyond that, in the 26th class, Darryl Carey from DeMatha, that's a name I'm keeping an eye on right now because he's one of the newer offers in that 26 secondary. He was on campus for the Ohio State game, picked up an offer a little bit afterwards there. So DeMatha coming off a championship along with teammate and Penn State wide receiver commit LeVar Keys. He's a guy I'm keeping an eye on. And then the last one right now in the early going is Jezeel Hart, cornerback from Virginia, one of the risers in the region. Penn State really likes him. His offer list continues to grow, and he's always a good interview. So I'm definitely looking forward to catching up with him afterwards. Those are the guys standing out right now. Definitely continue to check. If you're listening, you're a Lions 24/7 subscriber. If you're not, definitely jump on board. We've got a lot of good stuff coming for you. Definitely check back on the site throughout the week. That visitors list is going to grow. But that's where things stand right now in the early going.
30% off VIP access right now. If you're curious about this coverage, there's a lot more coming your way. We're about to jump into transfer portal season as well. So going to be VIP access really heavy on our boards with a lot of this roster movement and stuff coming our way. I'm just going back to Joey O'Brien real quick to hammer home the point of why Tyler Calvaruso led with his name. Number 49 overall in our 2026 rankings at 24/7 Sports. Number 7 athlete, as you said, there's some positional versatility there. Top overall prospect in the state of Pennsylvania, and he's from LaSalle College High School outside of Philadelphia, the same program where current All-American defender Abdul Carter was once roaming the field. So a lot to look at with O'Brien, a lot to look at with this list as it comes together during the course of the week. As Tyler said, you can catch all that at lions247.com. Tyler, enjoy the holiday week. I hope you get a little bit of rest and relaxation. We appreciate the effort you continue to put in, and just about in the final stretch of this 2025 cycle. So we look forward to breaking that down in greater detail with you next week.
Same goes for you, man. Thank you.
Good stuff, as always, from Tyler Calvaruso. Before him, you heard from Daniel Gallen and Mark Brennan. You can catch all of our content over at lions247.com. Again, with the holiday week, we're coming to you with 2 episodes over the course of this one before we get to our post-game episode from Beaver Stadium on Saturday. This and then Wednesday, you can look ahead to the next one. In that one, Mark and Daniel will rejoin me. We'll give you a preview, our outlook for the Nittany Lions, some predictions for this Game 12, and we'll also have a Maryland insider join us to break down the Terps as they come into town with a 4-game losing streak. That'll come your way and hit you before Thanksgiving. In the meantime, I'm Tyler Donahue, stepping aside from now. Thanks to all my Lions 24/7 colleagues for hopping on with us. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.